The River of Echoes, Chapter 1. The Whispering River. The jungle did not sleep. It never had not for a single night in the long history of the land. When the sun dropped behind the mountains, the darkness did not bring silence, but rather a new symphony, cicadas screaming frogs, croaking in the thousands, bats darting overhead, and the soft, constant hiss of the river as it pushed against its banks. For the soldiers of River Patrol Section 9, the jungle was not just noise. It was alive. It was watching. The patrol boat moved cautiously through the water, its hull slicing the current with the faintest ripple. The air was heavy with mist, clinging to the men's faces, soaking their uniforms, until the fabric felt like a second skin. Sweat never dried here. It simply joined the river and the rain and the breath of the trees. Even the stars overhead seemed drowned by the canopy, visible only in tiny fragments through the gaps in the leaves. The moon was a pale smear of light, filtered and warped by the steam rising from the jungle floor. Sergeant Harris stood at the bow, his eyes fixed on the river ahead. He was a man hardened by years of service, his jaw square, his hands steady even when the world trembled. Yet tonight, even he felt the unease that crept in with the mist. He had been briefed this was just another routine patrol, clearing the waterways, showing presence, keeping supply lines secure. But the whispers of the jungle said otherwise. He could feel them pressing in on his skull, subtle as breath. Behind him, Private Johnson wiped at his brow. The youngest of the crew, he had only been in Vietnam 3 months. His cheeks were still soft, his eyes too wide. He tried to steady his nerves by humming under his breath a broken fragment of a country song. But every time he caught his reflection in the water, he swore it wasn't just his own face looking back. Sometimes the eyes blinked too slowly. Sometimes the mouth moved when he didn't. Corporal Daniels lit a cigarette, the tip glowing bright in the darkness. "Damn place is worse than hell," he muttered. "At least hell's dry." He took a drag and blew the smoke into the mist, only to watch it curl unnaturally, twisting, as though drawn into invisible fingers. He crushed the cigarette out quickly, suddenly ashamed of giving the jungle another piece of himself to swallow. Miller, the radio operator, sat with the headset clamped over his ears. The static buzzed endlessly, but every so often he swore he heard something more, a voice faint, almost familiar. At first he thought it was interference. Then he thought it was the Vietnamese intercepting their channels, mocking them. But lately, the voices had taken on a different tone. He could have sworn he heard his father's voice 2 nights ago, telling him to come home. The sound had been so vivid, he nearly jumped overboard to swim back across the Pacific. Even now, he kept adjusting the dials, desperate to prove to himself it was just the radio. The river narrowed its banks, crowding close. Trees leaned out over the water like spectators craning for a better view. Their roots coiled in grotesque knots, half submerged in the current, slick with mud and algae. Strange insects skimmed the surface, leaving trails of silver in the moonlight. Every so often, a fish broke the surface with a splash that sounded too much like a body falling into water. The men tried to talk, to joke, to fill the air with something human, but the jungle swallowed their words. Every laugh seemed to echo back, distorted, as if someone unseen were laughing with them. Every sentence trailed off, devoured by the hiss of the river. Soon, silence returned, thick and oppressive, forcing each man to confront the thundering of his own heart. Harris finally spoke. "Stay sharp. Locals say this stretch of water's cursed." Johnson looked up sharply. "Cursed old superstition," Harris said, though his voice carried no conviction. "Fishermen drown here. Boats vanish. Nothing but stories." But Daniels spat over the side. "Stories don't make the hairs on your neck stand up." The words hung in the air, heavy as the mist. None of them argued. They all felt it, that sensation of being unwelcome, of trespassing in a place that did not belong to them. The river was not just water, it was memory. It carried the weight of centuries of wars, fought long before theirs, of blood spilled and bones left to sink into the mud. And it remembered. Hours passed. The boat drifted deeper into the jungle's throat. The trees closed tighter, their branches arching overhead until even the moonlight vanished. The air grew hotter, thicker. The river slowed its current, sluggish, as though reluctant to carry them any farther. The men's eyelids drooped, their bodies exhausted, but none dared sleep. The jungle did not permit such vulnerability. It was Johnson who heard it first, a whisper soft as the brush of a leaf. He sat upright, straining his ears. It came again, just his name, spoken in a voice he hadn't heard in years. His brother's voice. His brother who had died back in Texas in a car crash. "Tommy," the voice said, clear, close, from the water. Johnson clapped a hand over his mouth to stop the scream rising in his throat. He looked around wildly, but no one else reacted. Sweat poured down his temples. When he dared glance back at the water, it was just black again, calm and silent. But he couldn't shake the sound of it, the familiarity. He wanted to tell Harris. He wanted to tell anyone, but the words stuck heavy as stone. Moments later, Daniels cursed. "You hear that?" His eyes darted to the trees. Shapes moved between them, shadows too tall to be men, too thin to be animals. The branches shifted though no wind blew. "Swear to God, something's pacing us." Harris raised his rifle, scanning the bank, but saw nothing. Only the same wall of green, dense and impenetrable. Yet his skin prickled. He felt the gaze, too. They were not alone. The whispers grew stronger as the night deepened. Not just Johnson now, but Miller and Daniels, too. Each man heard someone different. A wife, a mother, a fallen comrade. Harris refused to admit it aloud, but he too heard something, his commanding officer from boot camp barking his name, telling him to hold the line. The voice was sharp, urgent, alive, yet impossible. The man had been dead for years. The river gleamed in the moonlight, a ribbon of black glass. As Harris looked down, his own reflection blinked back at him. Only it wasn't his. The eyes were wrong, darker, deeper, filled with something endless. He jerked back, heart-hammering, and barked an order to keep moving. By dawn, the men were hollow-eyed, their nerves frayed. They hadn't been attacked. Not a single shot had been fired. Yet they felt battered and broken in ways combat had never touched. The river had not killed them, but it had claimed something far worse, their certainty, their sanity, their grip on what was real. As the first pale light broke through the canopy, Harris swore he saw faces in the mist rising from the river. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds. Men in American helmets, men in Vietnamese hats, women, children, all staring silently, all whispering. And then the mist dissolved, leaving only the river, calm and endless. But Harris knew what he had seen. The river had spoken, and it was not finished. Chapter 2. Voices. Beneath the water, dawn came reluctantly, a pale smear of light that barely pierced the canopy. The jungle did not grow quiet with the rising sun. It only changed its voice. Birds screeched from hidden perches, their cries sharp and metallic, while the endless drone of insects swelled until it felt like a physical weight pressing against the eardrums. Mist clung low to the river, drifting in long, ghostly tendrils that wrapped around the patrol boat, as if trying to drag it down. The men of River Patrol Section 9 stared into it, bleary-eyed, exhausted, but unable to look away. Sergeant Harris had not slept. He stood at the bow again, his posture rigid, his gaze locked on the river ahead. The whispers from the night still lingered in his skull. He had tried to convince himself it was exhaustion. Imagination, tricks of acoustics. But no matter how he rationalized, the memory of those voices gnawed at him. They had been too clear, too personal. He hadn't heard random sounds. He had heard men he once knew, men long dead. And if he admitted the truth, it terrified him more than gunfire eve. Private Johnson sat hunched near the stern, his hands trembling as he fiddled with the strap of his rifle. He had barely spoken since the night before. His face was pale, his eyes hollow, and he flinched every time the river gurgled against the hull. The others tried not to notice, but they all knew. Johnson had heard something, maybe more than something. In this place, silence spoke louder than words. Miller fiddled with the radio again, the headset tight against his ears. Static filled the air, a constant backdrop like insects buzzing. Every so often, he would jerk his expression, tightening his lips, mouthing words only he could hear. Once Harris barked at him, demanding to know if there was contact, but Miller had only shaken his head. His hands shook as he turned the dials, though, and sweat slicked his forehead. The jungle was speaking through the machine. He was sure of it. Corporal Daniels tried to mask his nerves with bravado. He muttered curses under his breath, chewed on a cigarette that he never lit, and tapped the butt of his rifle against the floor of the boat. "Jungle's playing tricks," he said. "Whole damn country's one big haunted house. We get through this stretch, we'll laugh about it." But nobody laughed. Even Daniels couldn't summon the smirk to finish the thought. The river bent, curving into a narrow channel where the trees leaned so close that branches scraped the boat. The air grew darker despite the rising sun, shadows clinging stubbornly to the water's surface. Harris signaled for the engine to slow, and the men obeyed in silence. Every sound seemed amplified here, the splash of a paddlefish, the creak of the boat, the shallow breath of each soldier. Beneath it all, though, there was another sound, low, faint, like a chorus humming under the water. Johnson's head snapped up, his lips parted. "Do you hear that?" His voice was small, almost childlike. Harris froze. He hadn't wanted to acknowledge it, but now that Johnson spoke the truth aloud, he couldn't deny it. The sound was there. Not just sound words, whispers carried by the current. They rose and fell like waves overlapping, incomprehensible but undeniably human. It was as though the river itself spoke in 100 voices, murmuring secrets from below. The men leaned forward unconsciously, straining to catch a phrase, a single word. For a moment, Miller thought he heard his name. Daniels swore he heard his mother's voice praying softly in the language of his childhood. Johnson clutched his ears, whispering, "Oh, no, no," as tears welled in his eyes. Eyes on the banks, Harris snapped, though his own heart was pounding. "Stay sharp. Don't listen." But it was impossible not to listen. The whispers rose until they seemed to seep into the very bones of the men. The water lapped hungrily at the hull. The mist thickened, coiling into vague shapes that seemed to watch from the edges of vision. Faces surfaced in the fog. Faces the men knew, faces they could not possibly see here. A father's stern glare, a brother's crooked grin, a friend lost in the Tet offensive. The river carried them all. Suddenly, Johnson screamed. He leapt to his feet, pointing wildly at the water. "Tommy, he's down there. He's alive!" Before anyone could stop him, Johnson flung his rifle aside and vaulted over the side of the boat. The splash was deafening. The water swallowed him instantly, the mist churning as though the river itself had opened its mouth. "Man overboard!" Daniels roared, lunging for the edge. Harris grabbed him by the collar, yanking him back. "Don't you dare," Harris barked. It's got him, don't give it another! The men crowded the edge, shouting Johnson's name, but the river gave nothing back. No thrashing, no cry for help, only ripples. Then slowly bubbles rose to the surface, and with them came a sound that froze their blood. Laughter. High, thin, echoing laughter. It wasn't Johnson's voice. It wasn't any voice they recognized. It was the river's. Miller dropped his headset as a burst of static shrieked into his ears. From the speaker beneath the static came Johnson's voice. Clear, desperate. Help me. Please. The men stood in stunned silence, their faces pale. Daniels reached for the radio, but Harris slapped his hand away. That's not him, Harris growled. His voice shook despite his steel. That's not him anymore. The laughter faded, replaced once more by whispers. The current carried the boat forward slowly, inevitably, as though nothing had happened. But every man on board knew something had been taken from them, something they could never reclaim. Johnson was gone. The river had claimed him. For the rest of the day, no one spoke. The sun rose higher, burning the mist away, but the weight of the whispers lingered in their ears. The jungle seemed brighter, almost cheerful, but it felt mocking cruel. Harris kept his rifle tight in his grip, his jaw clenched so hard it ached. Miller sat frozen, staring at the radio, as though it might speak again. Daniels chewed his cigarette to pulp without ever lighting it. The patrol boat moved onward deeper into the endless green, carrying the men toward whatever waited in the river's heart. The jungle watched. The river whispered. And the soldiers of Section 9 began to understand that war was not the only enemy here. Something older, something patient had been waiting for them, and it would not let them leave whole. Chapter 3. The Drowned Eyes. The river had grown quiet again, deceptively calm, as though mocking the men who remained. After Johnson's disappearance, silence became their constant companion. Not the silence of peace, but the silence of something waiting, crouching in the shadows. Every creak of the boat, every ripple against the hull, carried the weight of a threat unspoken. And still the river carried them deeper, as if it had charted their course long before they had set out. Sergeant Harris kept his eyes forward, his jaw locked tight. He refused to look at the water, though he felt it pulling at him. The men obeyed him, or tried to, but it was impossible not to glance down. The river was a mirror, black and glassy, and in it, they sometimes saw more than their own reflections. It began with Miller. He was the one with the radio, the one whose sounds were cursed to catch what others missed. Late that afternoon, while the sun hung low and turned the water the color of blood, Miller pressed the headset close. Static crackled, rising and falling in unnatural rhythms. He froze. Beneath the static, someone was breathing. Shallow, ragged, like lungs filled with water. He tore the headset away, but the sound did not stop. It came from the river itself, seeping up from below the surface. Shut it off, Daniel snapped, his nerves fraying. Whatever it is, just shut it off. Miller shook his head. It's not the radio, he whispered. It's here. That night, when they anchored at a bend, where the jungle trees leaned in like watching giants, the river revealed more. Harris stood guard at the bow, watching mist rise from the surface, curling like smoke from a hidden fire. Then he saw them eyes. Dozens of eyes, pale and lidless, opening beneath the water's skin. They stared up at him, unblinking, the gaze of the drowned. For a moment, Harris couldn't breathe. The eyes swam closer, and with them came faces slack and pale mouths open as though mid-scream. Johnson was among them. He blinked and they were gone. Only ripples remained. Harris swallowed hard and forced himself not to speak. If he admitted it aloud, it would make it real. But the river did not let the others escape so easily. Daniels was next. He woke screaming in the middle of the night, clutching at his leg. "They grabbed me," he shouted. Hands, cold hands. The others rushed to him, but there was nothing there, only water dripping from the edge of the boat where his foot had dangled. By morning, no one could deny the truth. The river was watching. The drowned were waiting. The tension cracked at midday. The sun blazed overhead, yet the men shivered in their sweat. The boat drifted slowly past a cluster of fallen trees, half submerged in the current. Their roots twisted upward like skeletal fingers. Harris ordered the men to keep eyes sharp, but it was Daniels who broke discipline first. He squinted at the water and went pale. "Johnson," he breathed. "That's Johnson." The others turned. For an instant they saw him too, a figure beneath the surface, drifting with the current. His uniform still clinging to his body, his eyes open wide. His hand reached upward, fingers brushing just beneath the surface. Daniels lunged before Harris could stop him. He leaned so far over the side that the boat tilted dangerously. Daniels, Harris roared, but it was too late. The water erupted. Something pale shot upward, an arm slick and cold fingers clawing for purchase. It seized Daniels by the wrist and yanked him down. He screamed once before the river swallowed him whole. The water closed as if it had never parted. Silence fell again, broken only by the ragged breathing of the survivors. "Get the engine running," Harris barked, his voice hoarse. But Miller was frozen, his eyes locked on the spot where Daniels had vanished. Slowly, he raised the radio to his ear. Static crackled, and then impossibly Daniels's voice emerged. "Why didn't you save me?" it asked. Miller dropped the radio as though it burned him. The device clattered to the deck, still hissing with echoes. Harris snatched it up and slammed it off. His hands shook despite his iron will. No one spoke for a long time. When they finally did, it was in hushed tones, as though afraid the river might overhear. 2 men gone, claimed by something they could not fight. Harris told himself the mission came first, that they had to press on. But deep down he knew the river had set its terms. It was not enough to kill. It wanted to unmake them one by one. That night, as the boat drifted in uneasy sleep, the drowned eyes returned. Not just in the water, but in their dreams. Each man woke gasping, convinced he was underwater lungs, burning faces, pressing close in the dark. Harris lay awake, gripping his rifle, knowing that the jungle was not their battlefield anymore. The battlefield was inside them now, and the enemy wore the faces of the dead. The river whispered, and the soldiers listened whether they wanted to or not. Chapter 4. When the Jungle Breathes. By the time dawn bled across the canopy, the survivors no longer trusted sleep. Each hour of darkness had been punctuated by whispers, by the sensation of water in their lungs, by the vision of Daniels's hand reaching from beneath the river. The men had grown hollow-eyed, their faces drawn tight, as though carved from wax. They clung to their rifles not for duty, but for sanity. The jungle itself seemed aware of their weakness, leaning closer, watching. The river narrowed as they pressed further inland. Great trees rose from both banks, their roots coiling into the water, like serpents drinking. The air grew thicker, heavy with the stench of rot and blossoms that smelled too sweet, like perfume masking decay. Flies buzzed in dense clouds, though they never landed on the soldiers. They circled instead around invisible things, their wings shimmering in beams of sun that rarely touched the ground. Sergeant Harris felt the weight of every silence. The men avoided one another's eyes, for fear of what they might see reflected. It wasn't only the drowned who haunted them now, it was the jungle itself. Miller swore he could hear breathing beneath the static of his radio, long inhalations that matched the sway of branches overhead. Thompson muttered that the vines shifted when no wind stirred, inching closer, curling like fingers. At first, Harris dismissed it as fear, but then, as he scanned the tree line, he saw it too. The jungle moved with intention. Leaves quivered and rhythm branches bent, though the air lay still. It was subtle at first, a trick of the eyes. But the longer he stared, the more undeniable it became. The jungle was alive not in the natural way, but in some darker sense, as if the forest had grown lungs and a heart and a hunger. That night, as the men moored their boat at a muddy bank, the forest revealed its voice. They had built a small fire, the flames weak against the weight of the darkness. The canopy above devoured the smoke, swallowing it before it could rise. The men huddled close, their words short, clipped. Miller held his radio in his lap, fiddling through. No signal would ever reach them here. The static was company, at least until it changed. The noise thinned into a slow, steady rasp. Inhale, exhale. The firelight flickered in time with the rhythm. Harris looked around, realizing it was not coming from the radio alone. The sound vibrated in the ground, in the roots, in the air itself. The jungle was breathing. "Do you hear it?" Miller whispered. They all did. None admitted it. The forest's breath grew heavier as the night deepened. Shadows lengthened, though the fire did not shrink. Vines trembled where they hung, reaching lower, as though curious. And then came the shapes. At the edge of the firelight stood figures, dark, thin, motionless. Their faces were lost in shadow, but their eyes glimmered faintly like embers in the dark. Harris raised his rifle, but did not fire. He could not. His body locked in place as though the forest itself had commanded stillness. The figures swayed gently in rhythm with the breathing. When Harris blinked, they were gone. But the ground bore their footprints in the mud. Thompson broke first. He shouted, firing wildly into the trees. The muzzle flashes tore holes of light into the jungle, but there was nothing there, nothing but trees and vines and endless watching dark. Harris tackled him, wrenching the rifle away, but the damage was done. The jungle exhaled sharply, a wind that snuffed their fire flat. Darkness swallowed them whole. The night was a blur of screams. Something moved between the men, swift, silent, unseen. Branches lashed like whips, cutting flesh. Roots shifted underfoot, tripping them, dragging them into the mud. Harris fired blindly, his shot sparking through the black, but he hit nothing that bled. When dawn finally crept back, one man was gone. Thompson's bedroll lay shredded, his rifle bent as though by hands of iron. The mud bore the mark of something dragged away into the tree line. There was no blood, no trace, only the echo of his screams still ringing in their ears. The survivors did not speak his name. They could not bear to. From that day, the jungle never let them forget its presence. The trees leaned closer with each mile, their branches knitting overhead, until daylight was little more than a thin green haze. Vines brushed their shoulders like caresses. The air pulsed with breath, slow and patient, as though the forest had all the time in the world to consume them. Harris felt his resolve fray. He told himself they were soldiers, men of steel, unshaken by superstition. But as he looked into the eyes of his remaining men, Miller, Carter, and Rodriguez, he saw the truth. They were already ghosts, their faces pale, their gazes distant. The jungle had begun its work, and it would not stop until it had claimed them all. And that night, as Harris lay awake with his rifle across his chest, the forest whispered his name. Not once, not twice, over and over with every breath. Harris, Harris, Harris. And he knew with a certainty colder than death that the jungle no longer wanted just their bodies. It wanted their souls. Chapter 5. The Last Reflection. The jungle never truly gave them daylight again. The sky was gone, devoured by branches and leaves that knitted into a ceiling. What little light remained filtered green and gray, as though the world had sunk beneath a vast, rotting lake. Every sound they made, every step, every labored breath was swallowed and repeated, distorted, sent back to them in voices not their own. Harris led what was left of his men deeper into the forest, though even he no longer knew why. The mission, whatever it had once been, had dissolved into shadows. They had no destination. Only the river guided them now, its waters black and restless, carrying reflections that did not belong to the living. Carter muttered prayers under his breath as he walked, his lips cracked, his skin soaked in fever sweat. Miller clung to the radio, though it hadn't spoken a word of static in days. Rodriguez had stopped speaking altogether, his eyes fixed forward, as though he were already marching into the afterlife. They had not eaten in 2 days. Hunger clawed at their bellies, but none dared touch the jungle's fruit, which pulsed faintly as though veins carried blood beneath their skins. Water from the river tasted of iron and smoke. Still, they drank, for thirst was stronger than fear. Each mouthful carried whispers, words they could not quite understand yet, which lingered in their minds long after. By nightfall, they reached a clearing where the river widened into a pool. The surface was impossibly still, reflecting the jungle perfectly, though the reflection seemed older, twisted, as though it showed not what was, but what would be. The men stood in silence, staring at themselves in the water. For a moment it was peaceful. Then Carter screamed. His reflection had moved on its own. The others saw it too. Carter's mirrored face split into a grin so wide it tore the skin at the corners of his mouth. His eyes rolled white, then black, then empty. Hands reached up from beneath the reflection, dragging the mirrored Carter down into darkness. Carter fell to his knees, clawing at his own face as though trying to tear it off. Harris and the others tried to hold him, but his body convulsed, his mouth opening in a scream that poured out river water. His lungs drowned where no water touched him. When it was over, Carter lay still, his eyes staring wide. In the water, his reflection smiled. They buried him in shallow earth, though the ground quivered as though rejecting the corpse. The men said no words. There were none left. That night, Harris dreamed, or thought he dreamed. He lay awake against a tree when he saw Daniels dripping and pale standing on the opposite bank. Behind him stood Thompson and Johnson and Carter, all the dead men lined like soldiers on parade. Their eyes burned faintly in the dark, their mouths moving in silence. Harris tried to stand, but his body would not move. Then as one, the dead lifted their hands and pointed at him. The forest exhaled. The ground trembled. He awoke with his rifle in his hands, though he could not remember raising it. Miller cracked the next day. He smashed the useless radio against a tree, shouting at the voices to stop. Harris tried to calm him, but Miller's face was twisted, his teeth bared. "It's inside!" he screamed. "It's in my head, Harris. The river, the forest, the dead, they're all in me now." He raised his rifle, pressed the barrel under his chin, and pulled the trigger before anyone could stop him. The shot echoed like thunder, but the sound did not fade. It repeated again and again, until it was impossible to tell if the echoes were real or only in their minds. Rodriguez fell into silence deeper than before. He did not weep, did not shake. He simply walked to the river, knelt at its edge, and stared into the black water. Harris called to him, but Rodriguez did not answer. Hours passed, the sun shifted, and still Rodriguez knelt unmoving. When Harris finally reached him, his body was cold. In the water, his reflection was still staring, still alive, grinning as if mocking. Harris was alone. The jungle had stripped him of everything, his mission, his men, his faith. He wandered without direction, driven only by the pulse of the forest's breath. He no longer resisted drinking the river's water. It filled him with both dread and clarity. He saw visions of home, of his mother, of children playing in sunlit fields. But the visions bled, dripping with shadows that dragged them back into the water. He saw faces of Vietnamese villagers, women and children aflame in napalm, their mouths open in silent screams. He saw himself holding the torch, the lighter, the rifle. He saw not an enemy, but his own sins staring back at him. The forest guided him back to the pool of reflections. The water was waiting. Its surface quivered like skin beneath a heartbeat. Harris knelt, staring down into himself. His reflection was older, gaunter, hollow-eyed. It raised its rifle before he did, pressing the barrel to its own head. Harris shook his head, whispered no, but the reflection smiled a sad, knowing smile and pulled the trigger. The water rippled. Harris fell back, clutching his face, his ears ringing with the sound. When he looked again, the water was still. His reflection was gone. He screamed into the jungle, cursing it, begging it, demanding why. The forest did not answer in words. It answered with breath. Inhale, exhale. The sound filled his chest, filled his veins, until he could no longer tell where his lungs ended and the forest began. The vines curled around him gently, like arms cradling a child. He no longer fought. He no longer could. When American patrols found the boat weeks later, it was empty. No bodies, no bones, only rifles rusted and bent lying in the mud. The pool of water still reflected the jungle, but those who looked too long swore they saw faces beneath the surface, faces of soldiers whispering silently, waiting. Back home in small towns across America, the survivors of other platoons woke screaming from dreams of water filling their lungs. They never spoke of the jungle, but the fear lingered in their eyes. Some drank to silence the echoes. Some prayed, some simply stared into mirrors too long. None ever escaped the feeling that the river was still inside them, still breathing, waiting for the day they returned. And deep in Vietnam, the jungle breathed. Slow, patient, eternal. It had claimed them all.